with organized evil on a scale never before witnessed in the history of mankind. Well, I'm going to talk on a much different subject. I'm going to talk about what's happening financially. And it was in the 1830s when Abraham Lincoln addressed the Lyceum in Springfield, Illinois, and this is what he said. At what point shall we expect the approach of danger? By what means shall we fortify ourselves against it? Shall we expect some transatlantic giant to cross the ocean and crush us with a blow? Never. All the armies of Europe and Africa and Asia combined could never by force take a drink from the Ohio or make a mark on the Blue Ridge in a trial of 1,000 years. Then at what point should danger be expected? And I answer, if it ever reaches, it must spring up among us. It can never come from abroad. If destruction be our lot, then we ourselves must be its authors and its finishers. As a nation of free men, we shall live through all time or die by suicide. And I would like to suggest that we are dying by suicide today from a number of different point of views. But one of them is the financial situation that we face today that most people have no understanding of or no concept of. And so in a very brief period of time, I'm going to try to explain what Daniel Webster meant when he said, of all the contrivances for cheating the laboring classes of mankind, none has been more effective than that which deludes them with paper money. At another time he said, "'Tis strange but true, for there is nothing as powerful as the truth, and often nothing so strange." There is nothing as powerful as the truth, and often nothing so strange. Now, money has been used since the inception of mankind. It's simply a means of exchange. In some societies, they use seashells. In others, they use something called tally sticks. In a time when salt was in short supply, they used to use salt, and that's where the term, well, he wasn't worth his salt came from. They paid laborers in salt. If he wasn't worth his labor, why, he wasn't worth his salt. But of course, many, many years ago, many thousands of years ago, they hit upon the concept of coins, and it seemed that eventually concepts moved towards using gold and silver coins as a means of exchange. Now, paper money wasn't developed until about 170 years BC in China, and really wasn't used widely for about 1,000 years. So initially, money was a matter of gold coinage. 560 years before Christ was born in Bethlehem, one of the greatest societies in the world was the Greek city-states, and there they had a stable coinage based upon gold. However, 100 years later, Sophocles, who was the Greek philosopher, said that money, there's nothing in the world so demoralizing as money. Why would money be demoralizing? Because when you get money easily, you don't value it, and you tend to change your values, and wealth sometimes can be a terribly corrupting thing. Of course, we all like to be wealthy, we like to lead good lives, but he had noted almost 450 years before Christ was born that money obtained easily sometimes could demoralize society. Well, it was the following century. Plato actually lived from 427 to 347 BC. He lived 80 years. And of course, he lived at a time when the glory that was Greece was fading. I don't know how many of you have ever been to Athens and seen up on the Acropolis this great Parthenon standing there, the magnificent architecture, the remnant of Greek society, and that's all that's left. I mean, Greece is a basket case. It has been for many, many thousand, for almost 2,000 years. But at one time, Greece was the leading cultural center of the world. And of course, they had a stable currency. It was based on something called the gold dinar, D-I-N-A-R. And then, of course, because it was a prosperous society, people said, well, we ought to be more egalitarian. And they began moving towards something called democracy, where you had majority rule. And, of course, as Plato writes in his Republic, people found that, you could vote into office people who would give you what you wanted. And pretty soon the state began to spend more and more money. Where were they going to get the money? Well, they got it from debasing the currency. And, of course, as they debased the currency, why the very structure of their society began to crumble. Plato wrote this: democracy, which is a charming form of government, full of variety and disorder and dispensing a sort of equality to equals and unequals alike. Democracy passes into despotism. He wrote that over 350 years before Christ was born in Bethlehem. America was formed as a republic, not as a democracy, contrary to everything you hear from Al Gore and from Bill Clinton and from even George W. Bush. We are not a democracy, we are a republic. Our founding fathers knew what had been said, what Plato had written, what other great philosophers had written. 30 or 40 years before our Constitution was written, a man named Alexander Tyler wrote, "Democracies are temporary forms of government. They last only until people find that they can vote themselves, largesse from the public treasury. The politicians give them what they want. The country goes bankrupt, and the government is replaced by dictatorship." I mean, this is as old as time, and yet we don't teach this in our schools. Or if you get the 10th of the Federalist Papers, you remember the Federalist Papers were written to convince the people who were voting in support of the Constitution back in 1788 and 1789. The Federalist Papers were written by Madison and Hamilton and Jay, and in the 10th of the Federalist Papers, these articles were written as letters to the editor of that time. James Madison said, "Democracies are ere spectacles of turmoil and contention, are ere incompatible with personal liberty and private property, and are usually as short in their lives as they are violent in their deaths." So, actually, Plato witnessed what had happened in ancient Greece. And our founding fathers knew what had happened in ancient Greece, and that's why they created in America a republic. And you can read the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and the Declaration of Independence and the Federalist Papers and never once see the use of the word democracy other than to decry it and say the last thing we ever want is a democracy, we are to be a republic. So why are they lying to us? Very simply, because along with democracy comes the debasement of the currency. Well, history tells how it happens. Aristotle, of course, was Plato's student. He lived from 384 to 322 BC. And this is what he said. Witnessing what had happened in ancient Rome, there is nothing inherently wrong with a fiat currency, provided you have perfect authority and godlike wisdom for kings. And of course, where did you ever get perfect authority or godlike wisdom for kings? He said this with tongue-in-cheek, because he realized that a fiat money system, a debased money system, would lead to chaos and destruction as it did in ancient Greece. Well, of course, Greece, as you know, eventually became conquered by other nations. The nation, of course, which eventually overcame it was Rome. Rome started as a city there on the Tiber in Italy, and it started in 509. It lasted until 27 BC. 509 BC to 27 BC, the Roman Republic. It started as a republic, a nation of law. It descended into a democracy because of repeated wars, and certain people wanted to benefit from wars. When you had wars, you had to raise the taxes to finance the armies. Some people profited. The people who owned the land ended up paying so much taxes they lost their land. Then to placate the people who now were working as servants on their own land, why they began to provide services for them. They debased the currency. And the Roman Empire, the Roman Republic became so chaotic that Julius Caesar returned from the wars and established the Roman Empire. Now, the Roman Empire then lasted from 27 BC to 476 AD. And, of course, during that period of time, why Rome grew and prospered and was the most powerful nation in the world until about 300 AD, when a politician named, or an emperor named Diocletian, began to debase the currency, and the whole society began to crumble. And so he divided into two parts, an Eastern and a Western. In the Eastern section, centered in Constantinople, why you had the currency was known as Byzant, from the Byzantine Empire. It lasted for 1,000 years. It had a stable currency until 1282, when the currency became debased and the society collapsed. However, in the Western Empire, which was in Rome, why they began to placate the people. They became increasingly democratic. They pandered to the population. They provided the bread and the circuses. They debased their currency. And in 476, why the western part of the Roman Empire, centered in Rome, fell. And then, of course, Europe was plunged into what we call the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages, and gold and silver were certainly a means of currency and exchange. The next major issue that comes along would be in the 1200s. There was a group known as the Knights Templar. The Knights Templar established as a religious order that went to the Holy Land, originated in 1118. And of course, they were there to guard the temple square there in Jerusalem. And of course, they were to guard the people, the pilgrims going. But of course, they began to delve into the occult. They began to delve into the dark side. And when the Crusaders were defeated and the Templars returned to Europe, they became the most powerful bankers in Europe. And they had branches in every major city. And let's say you're going to travel from Paris to into Austria and to Vienna. Well, you certainly wouldn't want to carry your gold coins with you because somebody might, waylay you and take away your wealth. So you get a piece of paper from the Templars in Paris, and you'd give it to the people in Vienna, and they would give you the gold coins, taking out a little bit for their services. But they became sort of a brotherhood. They were a brotherhood. They were part of a secret order, the Knights Templar. And they existed then until 1307. In fact, it was Friday the 13th, 1307. Why is Friday the 13th so-called an unlucky day? Well, that was the day that Jacques de Molay, the leader of the Knights Templars, was arrested for heresy, and of course shortly thereafter he was executed. And it came out, of course, that these people were deeply involved in Luciferianism. They were a secret order, and they tied into the mystery religions while they're in the Holy Land during the 1100s. Well, the Templars then dispersed, but now you have this idea of a banking system, sort of a brotherhood of bankers. Nobody knows what happened to the Templars. Some of them went off to Scotland, and there's a great deal to suggest that they've always been there. In fact, if you go to study the modern-day Masonry, you will find there is an order of the Knights Templar. Isn't that strange? And you talk to Masons, or you read their books, the Brotherhood of Blood. Why? They will tell you they are descendants of the Knights Templar, and yet many of our presidents and many of the people in key positions and our judges and the police and our great corporations are tied into this order, and the fact most people don't know that is a reflection of the degree of control that exists today over what the American people think. And I'd like to suggest, if you haven't read my book or watch the video, The Brotherhood of Darkness, that you get it and watch it, and that's beyond what we're going to be talking about today. But it will give you some glimpse into what's going on. Well, in 1694, one of the most important events in all history took place. 1694, a man named William Patterson and his friends convinced the King of England to allow them to establish a central bank. Now, what is a central bank? It is a privately owned banking system that controls the currency of the realm, and they created the Bank of England at that time. And that became the organization, a private organization that is independent of government, that controls the currency. A few years later, in France, there was a Scots economist named John Law. And he approached the King of France, Louis XV. And he said, look, we've got a lot of people who are poor. If we could only increase the money supply, we could have enough money for everybody, and everybody would be prosperous. What's wrong with that? And the king wasn't very smart, and so he agreed. And they had seized some money from the church, so they used the land that they'd seized from the church as security for the money they began to print. And as they began to print money, there was more money available, and people became increasingly prosperous. And it seemed like this was a wonderful cure to the ills of society. You print money and people become prosperous, but the problem was that there was still a demand for goods, and pretty soon the price of the goods had to go up because people were willing to pay more for goods, and the whole idea of producing a product, well, if you could charge twice as much for the product, why shouldn't you? And so then there began to be a shortage of goods, so you had to print more money, and then you had to produce more goods and more money, and pretty soon the whole society crumbled under the weight of a debauched currency. And that was the currency known as John Law's currency. And it showed the effect of inflation. When you print money without anything behind it, without any restraint, why you eventually debauch the currency and bring great, great tragedy. Well, it was in 1776 when, of course, the Declaration of Independence was signed, and we had the war with England, and we had to, of course, finance that war by some means, and so the Continental Congress began to print money. They called it the Continental currency, and you had to accept that form of money and payment. But then, of course, you had to continue financing the revolution, so you had to print more money. The Continental, as it was known, the Continental dollar, started out with a certain value, but as they printed more and more and more of the money, it had less and less value, until eventually it became essentially worthless, and the phrase "it wasn't worth a continental" came to be accepted and accepted widely in this country. It debauched the currency. Fortunately, we did win the revolution. We were eventually able to redeem the money at some cost. But it was shortly after the French Revolution in 1789, it was in 1790, when, of course, they came back with this same wonderful idea again. We want prosperity, liberty, equality, fraternity in France. That was the cry of the revolution. How will we create liberty, equality, and fraternity? Why will we've seized all the money from all the property from the church. What we'll do is we'll use the church's property as security for the money, and we'll start printing money. And they did. There was a wonderful book written 100 years later by Andrew Dickinson White, who was the president of Yale University, talking about what happened in France after 1790, after the French Revolution, as they began to try to produce prosperity by printing money. And of course, initially it worked. Everybody became more prosperous, they got higher wages, but then the price of goods went up, and they had to print more money. And as he pointed out what it did, of course, they had a stock market at that time. And people were making fabulous sums of money in the stock market and reinvesting it in the stock market. And then you had other problems that would arise. You had the moral breakdown of that society. And then as things began to get worse and prices began to get out of line, you began to have wage and price controls. And all of these things have happened before, and they just don't work. Until finally, you would have to have a whole barrel full of money to buy a loaf of bread, and the whole society collapsed. And out of that collapse of the society, they were looking for the strong man to lead them, and Napoleon returned from the wars in Egypt and became, first of all, the representative of the revolution, and then ultimately the new emperor. They had overthrown one emperor and they'd replaced it with another, but it was the debauching of the currency that led to that. Now, of course, in about 1790, we established our first central bank here in the United States. And a few years later, in the early 1800s, Thomas Jefferson wrote this, and we actually have this in the syllabus. You'll want to read it and read it again. It comes from the master thoughts of Thomas Jefferson, writing, after the effect of the central bank had become very obvious here in the United States. Everything predicted by the enemies of banks in the very beginning is now coming to pass. We are to be ruined by a deluge of bank paper, as we were formerly by the old continental paper. It's cruel that such revolutions and private fortunes should be at the mercy of avarice adventurers who, instead of employing their capital, if any they have, in manufactures, commerce, and other useful pursuits, make it an instrument to burden all the interchanges of property with their swindling profits which are the price of no useful industry of theirs. Prudent men must be on their guard in this game of robins alive, and take care that the spark does not extinguish in their hands. I am an enemy to all bank discounting bills or notes for anything but coin. And you remember when we created our Constitution, one of the stipulations of the Constitution that all our currency was to be based upon gold and silver. No state shall enter into any treaty, coin money, emit bills of credit, make anything but gold and silver coin, and tender in payment of debt. Our founding fathers understood that when you debauch the currency, you eventually destroyed the freedom. But you see, that message has long since been forgotten. Well, of course, we had the first Bank of the United States. Its charter ended about the time of the War of 1812, and of course, we had to finance our battle against the British, and of course, then in 1816, the charter of the second Bank of the United States was established in 1816. And of course, the banks used their power to create money to actually exploit the people. You have to understand that banks create money out of nothing. They always have. For instance, you leave $100 in gold there, and they lend out $50 based upon the $100 you put in, hoping that everybody won't come back at the same time getting their money. and you can increase the money supply very, very easily depending upon how much money you issue. And as long as people think it's redeemable in gold, and it is all perception, it is a belief. It has no basis in reality. And of course, you know how we start our program every day. Reality is usually scoffed at. Perception is usually king. And that was the perception. Your money in the bank was perfectly safe. But the question is, was it perfectly safe? Well, by 1832, why, the bankers had pretty well fleeced the American people, and Andrew Jackson was the President of the United States. He was elected in 1828. And you can remember Jefferson was president for 8 years, from 1800 to 1808. He was followed by Madison and Monroe. So by 1824, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe had had 8 years of presidency. Andrew Jackson ran for the presidency. John Quincy Adams ran against him, but there was the anti-Masonic Party at that time. People don't remember, probably most of you don't remember 1824, but a man named Captain Morgan, who had been a Mason, had actually written a book about the secret Masonic ceremonies and about the blood oaths that they took, and of course they killed him. And when it became apparent to the public that the Masons working at the highest levels of our government were involved in murderous plots to kill anyone who would reveal their secret oaths, why, there was a tremendous uprising against Masonry, and it became the anti-Masonic Party. And the anti-Masonic Party, being a third party, split the vote between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson, and John Quincy Adams became the President of the United States. In 1828, why, Andrew Jackson became president, and he ran on the whole concept of doing away with the charter of the Second Bank of the United States, saying that the bankers were fleecing the people, and eventually in about 1832, he did away with the charter of the Second Bank. Well, of course, he gave the banks themselves the ability to issue money, and that was even worse, because then the bankers did not simply use the federalized money and then issue money based upon that. They issued money on their own, and within 4 years you had wild inflation in the United States, and we really didn't get away from that inflation until the time of the Civil War. Well, to finance the Civil War, why, Abraham Lincoln issued something known as the Lincoln Greenback in about 1862, and that was inflationary, but it was a lot better than paying the bankers about 20 to 30% interest, which is what they wanted to provide the money. So the federal government at that time created money out of nothing. Fortunately, the war ended within a few years, and they were able to pay that money back. But there were always those, and there was something called the Greenback Party that said, look, if we just put more money in circulation, everything will be fine. If we have more money, there'll be prosperity. Well, fortunately, the Greenback Party failed. The United States redeemed the Greenbacks, and we had a stable currency that was backed by gold for a period between 1879 and about 1922. Well, then, of course, the bankers, of course, always loved to play games to manipulate people, and the local banks would make money very readily available, and they did this in 1873, and 1889, and 1893, and 1907, and each time money became available, people, motivated first by greed, why, my goodness, I'm going to borrow the money, I'm going to invest it in the stock market, I'm going to buy property, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to make a lot of money, and that's the greed aspect. And then the bankers would make money in short supply. And then the fear sets in. So it's between greed and fear, and greed and fear, and greed and fear, while you're constantly manipulating the people. So by 1908, the people were furious, and they realized that the bankers were playing games with them. They didn't realize the occult background behind the banking system, but they knew that something was seriously wrong. And so they called the federal government to make some sort of a special accommodation to provide a stable currency for us. And then in 1910, on a sealed railway train that left from New York and went to Georgia to Jekyll Island, the men who would create our new monetary system, using artificial names in a true conspiracy to create a new monetary system, people like Paul Warburg, Senator Nelson Aldrich, for whom Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller was named, the heads of the J.P. Morgan banks at that time, United States senators. There were 8, 9 people. If you haven't read the book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, you must get it and you must read it, because the story is laid out there as one of the most fantastic conspiracies of all time. What they wanted was to create a United States central bank controlled by bankers having answerable to no one in our government. But how would you get the American people to do that? Because they didn't trust the bankers. Well, let's call it the Federal Reserve System. I mean, it sounds like it has to do with our government. People will never suspect that this is actually a central bank being created to prevent the bankers from controlling our monetary system, and that's just what they did. The Federal Reserve System came in 1913, and your money was as good as gold. It was 40% gold backing, 100% backed by cash reserves. It was 140% backed. Every dollar had 140% backing. What was wrong with that? Well, what was wrong with it was that it had a 40% gold backing, and the cash that they were using was also backed by gold, but it was the same gold, and it was all simply smoke and mirrors. The First World War came along. Of course, we had to finance our entry into the war by 1920. While we were beginning in an inflationary spiral, they raised the interest rates, slowed down the inflationary spiral. And then in 1922, one of the most important things happened. And that was there was an international meeting, and they decided that they were going to come up with a wonderful new system by which they would create money, the gold exchange standard. All currency would be backed by gold reserves and currency reserves. So you're going to have artificial money, currency backing currency. Doesn't that sound logical? But you see, the average person couldn't understand what's happening because it's done in such a complicated matter. And these people speak in such vague terms that if you ever read anything that Alan Greenspan says, you really can't figure out what he's saying, and that's because you're not supposed to understand what he's saying. It's like the term sustainable development. Define it. They never define it. It's simply a term, and it can mean whatever you want it to mean. It was in 1912 when Woodrow Wilson was running for the President of the United States, and you'll find in your syllabus the pages from this book. It was called The New Freedom. It was published in 1913, but this was based upon speeches he had given when he was running for the presidency in 1912. And this is what he said. Since I entered politics, I've chiefly had men's views confided to me privately. Some of the biggest men in the United States in the field of commerce and manufacturers are afraid of somebody, are afraid of something. They know that there is a power somewhere so organized, so subtle, so watchful, so interlocked, so complete, so pervasive, that they'd better not speak about it above their breath when they speak in condemnation of it. A force so pervasive that men are afraid to speak of it. And this is Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States, speaking. Well, of course, after the 1922 gold exchange meeting, why we got into a tremendous inflationary spiral. They lowered our interest rates. We had the roaring 20s. Of course, in Europe, they had the terrible, terrible inflation because of the war debts that were imposed upon Germany following the First World War. And it was that disastrous inflation where you would have to have a wheelbarrow full of marks to buy a loaf of bread that led ultimately to the establishment of the Third Reich, and Hitler's rise to power. In the United States, of course, we had our inflationary spiral. It peaked out in 1929. In October of 1929, when the Federal Reserve System raised the interest rates and began to pull money out of circulation and plunged us into the Great Depression. Now, Herbert Hoover was the president. He had run under the caption and came to office in early 1929 promising 2 cars in every garage and a chicken in every pot. It ended up with 2 chickens in every garage. And we had 10 million unemployed. I can remember the days of the Great Depression. I can remember people coming to the door at our little house on Excelsior Avenue in Oakland and, asking for food or saying they'd work for food. And my mother would always provide them with a sandwich and a cup of coffee, and they'd put a little mark next to the doorbell so that the next man coming along would know it was an easy mark. But people were really going hungry at that time. And there were terrible, terrible times, and every time our economy started to right itself, the Federal Reserve System pulled money out of circulation. We have a video over here, someplace I think it's called The Monopoly Men, and you'll hear Milton Friedman talking, Milton Friedman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, talking about how the Federal Reserve System created this whole debacle, and every time it started to right itself, they pulled money out of circulation. But a lot of people thought they made a mistake. I don't think they made a mistake at all. They used this to justify first closing the banks. President Roosevelt became president in 1933 on March 4th. 2 days later, he closed the banks and nationalized all the gold. It was illegal for any American citizen to own gold, and you had to turn in your gold certificates, you had to turn in your gold, or they were going to send you to prison. On November 23rd of that year, And you'll find this letter in your syllabus. It's a letter that President Roosevelt sent to Colonel House. I found this back at Yale University when I went to Colonel House's papers there. And this is what he says on the second page. The real truth of the matter is, as you and I know, that a financial element in the larger centers has owned the government ever since the days of Andrew Jackson, and I'm not wholly accepting the administration of W.W., meaning Woodrow Wilson. The real truth of the matter is, as you and I know, that a financial element in the larger centers has owned the government ever since the days of Andrew Jackson, and I'm not wholly accepting the administration of W.W. Then, of course, the following year, FDR raised the price of gold from $20.67 to $35 an ounce. But, of course, all the government spending couldn't rectify the depression that we had, 10 million unemployed in 1939. How do you get out of it? Well, you have a war. And they manipulated the United States into World War II. And if you haven't seen our 4-tape set on Pearl Harbor or read Robert Stennett's book, Day of Deceit, you need to. Do you realize that to this very day, most of the information dealing with what happened on December 7th is still classified? Do you think we're trying to keep Hirohito from finding out what happened that day? No, they don't want the American public to learn that they would leave those boys to die at Pearl Harbor because, of course, they needed to get us into the Second World War. And it's being justified by many people saying, well, look, I mean, we had to stop Hitler before he took over the world, but what they never mention is we were financing Adolf Hitler as well. For instance, we have one book here called Secrets of the Tomb. It's on the Skull and Bones. You'll be interested to know that Prescott Bush, the grandfather of our president, was indicted for financing and working with Adolf Hitler during the Second World War, not simply before. And we have so much material and documentation on that if you ever want to get into it. No, this was all being manipulated almost as if somebody had written a great script. Well, in 1944, during the war, the Bretton Woods Agreement was written. By that time, there were $35 billion in gold in the entire world, and the United States had $24 billion of it. So all currencies were convertible into gold, and we would convert it into gold at $35 an ounce. And in the immediate post-war period, the system worked pretty well. Gold was all currencies were convertible into gold. The only trouble was that any country could print all the currency it wanted, and countries printed currency and reclaimed it with gold. And soon, of course, our $24 billion in gold was down to about $10 billion. So that on August 15th, 1971, President Nixon closed the gold window, and suddenly all currencies had no backing for them at all. Now, during the 1960s, 1965, Lyndon Johnson took the silver backing from our currency. It used to say on the dollar bill or on the Federal Reserve note, this note is legal tender for all debts, public and private, and is redeemable at any branch of the Treasury or any Federal Reserve Bank for lawful money. This is redeemable for lawful money. And then one day, you looked at the note and it said, this note is legal tender for all debts, public and private, period. And at that point, America was on a fiat money system. Now, of course, 1971, we were in the midst of the Vietnam War. We had to pay for the war. We had to begin inflating the currency. And, of course, we gradually inflated the currency until the point by 1980, the Fed had to raise the interest rates to 20% to quell the inflation. And they had to create what was known initially as the Reagan recession. It wasn't the Reagan recession. Ronald Reagan really had nothing to do with that at all. It was the holdover from what had happened during Carter and the previous administrations. Ronald Reagan ran at the point saying we now have $1 trillion in national debt. $1 trillion. Do you know how much $1 trillion would be if we took dollar bills and we stacked them up? It'd be 2/3 of the way to the moon. I can remember that. $1 trillion, and Jimmy Carter did it. Of course, when Ronald Reagan left the White House, our national debt was $2.8 trillion. He ran up far more than Carter ever did. Carter only added about $200 billion to the federal deficit, while Ronald Reagan added $1.7 trillion to the national debt. And today our national debt is about $6.1, $6.2 trillion. And of course, we are in real trouble economically. Well, of course, about 1982, James Dines, who's one of my favorite experts, financial advisors, gave a buy signal. And he said, get out of gold. Now remember, in 1980, 1981, gold went up to $850 an ounce and went back down to about $350. Silver went to $50 an ounce, went down to $3 or $4 an ounce. And James Dine made the most stupid statement I've ever heard. He said, sell your gold and sell your silver and get into the stock market because you're going to see the greatest bull market of all time. I wish I'd listened to him. He was actually right. And you saw what he is referred to as the mother of all bull markets. It topped out in the year 2000 at about 11,050 on the Dow Jones. And you have to understand that all these indicators are just indicators are used to confuse you. You are dealing with 30 stocks in the Dow Jones. What you really want to watch is, of course, what's happened to the Standard & Poor. Certainly, the Dow Jones, if you watch the Dow Jones, has dropped about 30%, a little less than that now, since the recent recovery. Standard & Poor's has gone down about 45%. The NASDAQ has gone down about 80%. We are in a recession, and we will still soon be in a depression. And you have to understand what is really going on today. And one only has to read the Wall Street Journal on a regular basis to get some glimpse of what's happening. And just this last week or so, picking out some of the articles, we find that in Germany, the Commerzbank, the third largest bank in Germany, has lost half of its value. We find that the Societe Generale, it's one of the largest organizations in Europe, financial, has lost 63% of its profit. Credit Lyons in France has lost 27%. Alliance, which is a large European organization, has lost $2.52 billion. Credit Suisse reported a $1.48 billion loss. Lehman's is laying off 4% of its staff. EchoStar posted a $168 million loss. Price Waterhouse Cooper posted a 4% decline. Edison Schools reported a wider period loss, but forecast a small full-year deficit. That's just one day in the Wall Street Journal. And of course, as you find that the United Airlines pilots and machinists are all willing to take lower wages. Because what happens during this period of time is more and more and more people are thrown out of work, is that people are willing to work for less. Recently, a startup company announced they were going to hire 100 people. They put the word out. They expected about 400 applications. They had 5,000 applicants. People are desperate for work. You go over to Silicon Valley, and what was once a year and a half ago was thriving. The parking lots were full. The parking lots are empty now. You turn on your television, you can buy a Cadillac, nothing down, 0% interest, no payments for 90 days or more. And all of the automakers are doing that because they're in real trouble. What people do not understand is that these companies have been reporting tremendous profits. And of course, where were they getting the profits? Well, of course, they all have pension funds. They're required by law to have pension funds according to the union contracts. And the pension funds, they weren't putting any money into because the pension funds were making so much money in the stock market. Tremendous profits. They were invested in Enron and in WorldCom and in Global Crossing. A recent article in the Wall Street Journal reported that General Motors now owes their pension fund $12.9 billion they're going to have to pay before that they can even begin to make a profit. However, according to the Dines letter, the figure is really almost $30 billion. And I checked this with Kelly O'Mara, who's writing an article on Inside Magazine. Our major corporations owe their pension funds over $300 billion. And no matter how you slice it, that's an awful lot of money that they're going to owe their pension funds before they can show any profit for themselves. Our country is in real economic problems. And most people really have no idea what this is all about because we have a massive debt pyramid. How do banks create money? Well, very simply. You go to the bank and you say, I've got $10,000 down, I want to buy a $100,000 house. They lend you $90,000. Based upon the $10,000 you gave them, they create $90,000 out of nothing. It's made out of total thin air. when you read your syllabus, read the section in there written by Professor Carroll Quigley, one of the smartest people in the world. He was Bill Clinton's mentor. He was a liberal historian who taught at Princeton and Harvard before he went to Georgetown University. And he understood what makes the world go around and how this whole banking movement dominates the world. He believes in this idea of rule by an elite. And if you read the entire text of Tragedy and Hope, which we have here, all 1,342 pages, you'll know more than most college professors do. Because, of course, he was really very, very outspoken as far as explaining how this works. So what we have is all these money being created out of absolutely nothing. The Federal Reserve System creates money out of nothing. How do they do that? Why, simply they have the Treasury print up a lot of money, and then they have them print up a lot of bonds, and the Treasury Department gives the Fed the money, the Fed gives the Treasury Department the currency, and the Treasury spends it into the population, into circulation. They want to take money out, why the Treasury Department buys bonds from the banks and takes money out of circulation. This last year, they put out, according to Don McElvany, $2 trillion to try to get our economy going. And it's not working. We've got basically $8 trillion in monetary increments in the United States today. Now, you have to understand, we still have a gold backing. If you read the Wall Street Journal every Friday, they will tell you the Federal Reserve statistics. They say we have $10 billion in gold, but that's valued at $42 an ounce. If you look at it, this really is $11 billion, but if you figure it's they value it at $42 an ounce, we really have about $100 billion. We have $100 billion in gold. We have $660 billion currency in circulation. On top of that, we have monetary increments that take us up to about $8 trillion. And that's not so bad unless you stop and start looking at our debts. We have a federal debt of over $6 trillion. We have a corporate debt of over $6 trillion. We have personal debts of $6 trillion. We have a housing debts over $6 trillion. And we have over $20 trillion in unfunded mandates, money we promised to pay out to people in Social Security and pensions. And there is no money, and there's no way we can come up with it. So the only way that they're going to be able to get out of the mess they're in today is to let these various debts fall into default. To understand what's going on, you really have to understand what's going on in Japan. If you read your syllabus, you'll read the writings of Hans Sennholz, certainly one of the great economists of our time, a disciple of Ludwig von Mises, who was the father of the sound money Austrian school of economics, who said government is the only entity that take a perfectly good commodity like paper and put green ink on it and make it become worthless. What we are going to see is a two-stage response. First of all, we're going to see a period of deflation. And if you read the Dines letter, if you read the writings of the really smart economists, and you begin reading what they're talking about, the Federal Reserve System, they're saying, well, we're not going to have deflation. Well, we don't think there's going to be deflation. Well, if it occurs, why, we'll deal with that when it comes. What happens when you have deflation is you have a debt. But the trouble is you can't get the money to pay off the debt, and so you go into default. And you lose your home, you lose your car, you lose whatever you have put up there. Now, they're very, very clever. They've made it very easy in the past to go bankrupt. Now they're making it very difficult for you to go bankrupt so that you can't get out from underneath your debt. And debt is what's going to weigh down our companies. Many of our great corporations have twice as much debt as they have value. And many of the great corporations are going to fail. You have to understand we've done away with our industrial base. We've transferred it to China. We've transferred it to Malaysia. We've transferred it into Mexico, into South America. America once was the greatest economic force in the entire world. We were the greatest lending nation in the world. Today we're the greatest debtor nation in the world. And every year we're running another $400 to $450 billion deficit. And as George Soros said, and George Soros is one of the people who works within this whole world occult movement. And recently in the Wall Street Journal he said this. He said, you know, we cannot sustain the deficits we're running. The dollar is going to drop in the next several years 30%. And if we go into a recession, it's going to drop much further. What does that mean? It means the value of your pension fund, your savings bonds, your annuities, your insurance everything goes down 30%, 50%, 90%. Let's see what's happened in Argentina in the last 9 months. Argentina 9 months ago was a prosperous economy. Today, half the population lives in abject poverty. They're walking the streets, they're going to garbage dumps looking for food. Why? Because they trusted their government that said, we will tie the peso to the dollar, you can believe us, nothing can happen. The peso was as good as the dollar. And one day they woke up and they found the government had lied to them. They had 5 governments within a period of just a few months because there was rioting in the streets. And let me tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that they're planning on exactly the same thing happening here in the United States. They know that there's going to be tremendous political volatility. They're already making preparations for an economic change. In fact, they're even printing a new colored currency that will be issued either next year or the year after that. We are in a situation where the market is going to continue dropping. They have people working with the stock markets who actually call the plunge team, who go in and in violation of all of our laws, manipulate the stock market. If you and I did it, we'd go to prison. When they do it, why, of course, they get reelected. But the problem that we have today is that people do not understand that whatever goes up will come down again. And just as the laws of gravity cannot be violated, so the laws of economics cannot be violated. We have a house of cards with $100 billion in gold at the maximum, and of course a debt that is estimated in the neighborhood of $38 trillion. Now, it's like playing musical chairs. You've got $100 billion in gold, and maybe you've got $660 billion money in circulation based upon the $100 billion in gold. When you're playing musical chairs and you've got 4 chairs and 50 people playing in the game, what happens when the music stops? Why, you've got about 46 people out of the game. We are moving into a deflation, and you better get yourself prepared for that. And you do that, of course, by getting out of debt as much as you possibly can, certainly cutting back on your purchases, which is exactly what the people of Japan are doing. Japan is the 2nd largest economy in the world today. 10 years ago, their banks, eight of their banks were 8 of the 10 largest banks in the world. Today, those banks are simply penny stocks. And even as penny stocks, why their value is decreasing. I mean, it's amazing what's happening in Japan. They keep spending more and more money. They have spent enough money that their national debt is 1.5 times the GDP, gross domestic product. And they can't get the economy going again. Well, the same thing is happening here in the United States. And one reason for the war is an effort to stimulate the economy, but that's not going to solve all of the problems that we're facing today. Down the line, they're going to inflate the economy. They're going to pour money out, just as they always have throughout all history, to try to keep this thing from collapsing. And at that point, of course, anything you have in monetary increments will be lost. So what should you do? Well, first of all, you better get anything you possibly can into fixed assets, because fixed assets hold their value. They can be manipulated, but they hold their value. Gold, silver, and platinum. And you should probably have 1/3 of your monetary, what you have, that you can mobilize in that. Now, there's nothing wrong at all in the stock market, but the one stock you would want to be in would be gold and silver, because those are the only things that are moving up at the present time, and in uncertain times, this is where people turn. India is accumulating gold. The Muslim countries are accumulating gold. China is buying gold. The Japanese bought a fantastic amount of gold because they don't trust their currency. And of course, if the American people do trust their currency, they're going to lose everything they have. And then, of course, you would certainly want to have some of your money in readily available sources. You can't trust the banks. We have today $50 trillion in something called derivatives, and these are like futures contracts or commodities contracts. I don't know any of you have ever played commodities, but there's a way you play commodities. It's a wonderful way to make a small fortune out of a large fortune. Well, what's the derivatives? There are about $100 trillion in derivatives in the world. We hold $50 trillion. J.P. Morgan holds almost $25 trillion of that. Our banks are incredibly shaky, and what you're not hearing is many of them really are on the verge of collapse. But they can't let you know that because your perception can't be that, or you might begin realizing what's really happening. So if you're going to be in anything at all, be in short-term bonds. Short-term, but you're going to have to be very agile as well. because you're going to have to realize that sooner or later they're going to turn to inflation. Now, if you have money in short-term bonds, you can perhaps as this thing begins to implode, if you have the money to do it, you can invest. There are going to be some wonderful opportunities to buy land when the land or the real estate bubble bursts, and other things when these things become increasingly cheap. Cars that are selling now, zero down, zero interest, zero payments. A lot of these people are going to lose their jobs, and you're going to be able to pick them up at a fraction of what they were actually sold for. So if you have the money, certainly have some in hand, but realize that when they turn on the money spigot and we start to inflate the economy, why you're going to have to be prepared and prepared to move and move very quickly. And so you have to understand how this is all coming together. I suggest that you certainly read what the material we provided for you, the material from Hans Senneholz, talking about what's happening in the United States, what's happening in Japan, and understand that what's happened in Japan is going to happen here in the United States. Understand that we have a fiat money system, a monetary system built upon nothing but confidence in confidence. And of course, this is why and how people are cheated out of their funds, out of their prosperity. For as Daniel Webster said, of all the contrivances for cheating the laboring classes of mankind, none have been more effective than that which deludes them with paper money. We've had wonderful prosperous times. We've had great times. We've seen the greatest prosperity of any nation in all recorded history. And you're beginning to see the pillars of our society begin to tumble. And there is a wild card. There is the Islamic terrorist wild card. And in this next period, we will actually begin to talk a little bit about the Islamic influence and their plan on what's going to happen. And then we will tell you what the occultists have told me about what they anticipate happening. But we have about 3 minutes for questions. I guess 7 minutes for questions. Yes.
If you say to invest in gold, you said it's the logical that some president have had said that gold was.
And the question is, why invest in gold if in the past they've nationalized it? That's why you invest in gold, platinum, and silver. You do not just invest in one, because there's always that possibility. I don't know what's going to happen. We may lose everything we have. In fact, we may very well all succumb. I believe that there is a genocidal agenda out there, but our job is to do the best we can. And then, of course, leave the rest for the Lord.
Can you go online real time and just tell us where your money's moving?
Well, with that question, I'm going to take just a moment.